They said the mill had been abandoned for centuries. I touched the flower. It whispered names I had never heard, tracing sins across my skin with invisible fingers, mapping fear and guilt I did not know I carried. By the time I realized it was not just memory, it was alive, the village had already begun to feel it too. The wind tore through the broken sails of the old Dutch mill, rattling the splintered wood and sending shards of rotted plank clattering to the floor like brittle bones. The air was thick with the sour, almost metallic scent of fermented wheat and rot, a smell that clung to the lungs and made each breath an effort, as though inhaling centuries of despair. Beneath the decayed beams, sacks of pale, dusty flour shifted on their own, trembling with a rhythm that seemed impossible, whispering names that belonged to men long dead, their voices twisted and broken, full of accusation, fear, and the remnants of regret. Each grain trembled under the faintest touch, quivering like a pulse, leaving trails across the skin that were not visible a moment before, thin lines that twitched and writhed, mapping sins that no tongue had ever confessed and memories that no living soul could endure. The floorboards groaned beneath the weight of invisible footsteps, echoing in the emptiness, a sound both familiar and wrong, as if the mill itself remembered each step of those who had suffered within its walls, binding the living to the dead in a choreography of shame and inevitability. Shadows stretched along the warped beams and fractured windows, moving in ways that defied reason, curling around the trembling sacks of flour, bending toward the touch of hands as though drawn by some sentient intelligence hidden in the dust. Each flicker of motion seemed to awaken something older, something patient, pressing against the nerves and tendons, forcing the body to shiver and the skin to tighten in anticipation. The first touch of the flour brought a shock of sensation, a fine, crawling sting across the fingertips that spread like a whisper along the arms and up the collarbones, faint lines etching themselves into pale flesh as if the grains themselves were writing a ledger no eye could read. The more he moved through the mill, the thicker the air became, heavy with the scent of decayed wheat and the faint tang of iron, as though the walls themselves were bleeding past memories into the atmosphere, coating every surface with the residue of guilt. The sacks shifted closer when he passed, as though drawn by an invisible magnet, their whispers rising into a chorus of complaints and confessions, overlapping and tangled, forming a language that was understood only by the body, by the skin and the muscles that flinched at invisible commands. Each breath pulled more of the scent of rot into the lungs, the powdering flour drifting down like ash, landing on shoulders and arms, pressing against flesh with a weight that was both delicate and inescapable, leaving faint, moving marks that reflected not his own sins alone, but the echoes of those who had fallen before him. The windows, cracked and filmy with years of neglect, let in pale, trembling light that cast everything in a sickly gray, highlighting the twitching lines across the arms and neck, the subtle quiver of muscle that betrayed the unspoken language of accusation and remembrance. The wind outside pressed against the sails and walls like a living thing, bending the mill, shifting its beams, amplifying the whispering and the pulsing sensation of the flour, until he felt himself caught in a tide of history and punishment, a current that flowed through the fingertips, up the spine, into the marrow, marking each hesitation, each glance, each thought of retreat with fine, living streaks that glimmered faintly in the pallid light. By the time he paused in the center of the room, the smell of rot and wheat thick around him, the sacks quivering like captured hearts, and the flour crawling along every inch of exposed skin, he realized that the mill did not merely preserve memory. It had become memory itself, alive in the dust and shadows, in the twitching lines across flesh, in the faint, persistent whispering of names and deeds that would not rest, a tribunal older than time, patient, inevitable, and impossible to escape. The first worker to enter the mill after its abandonment felt the air thicken with centuries of despair, a dense, almost tactile pressure that pressed against lungs and ribcage, forcing each breath to claw its way through a haze of rot and fermented wheat. The walls, blackened and warped with age, seemed to pulse imperceptibly, exhaling the memory of labor, suffering, and sudden death, as though the wood and stone themselves had absorbed the anguish of broken bodies and preserved it in every splinter, every creaking joist, every grain of dust. The metallic tang of decay lingered in the air, subtle at first, then growing into a sharp, acrid bite that clung to skin and hair, settling into the throat and nose, embedding itself into memory. He stepped cautiously across the floorboards, each groan underfoot echoing like the slow, mournful cry of men who had toiled here long before, their lives ended in exhaustion, injury, or hunger, and he felt the weight of their final moments pressing down on his shoulders, bending him forward, forcing his spine to curve as though in reverent obeisance to the mill itself. The sacks of pale, dusty flour shifted in their corners, trembling as if breathing, whispering in tones that carried both menace and sorrow, names he could not know, deeds he could not imagine, murmurs of men crushed by the relentless rhythm of grinding stones, each syllable vibrating in the air, seeping into his ears and crawling into the marrow of his bones. When his hands brushed the surface of the flour, it stung sharply, like invisible needles tracing the edges of old crimes, scratching along nerves and tendons, leaving faint, twitching streaks across skin that had no business appearing, mapping sins that were not his own, but that he somehow felt as intimately as if he had committed them. Lines appeared along his forearms, curling and spiraling in patterns that moved beneath the skin, shifting as he flexed his fingers, a living map of guilt and failure, a ledger of remorse and hesitation that pulsed faintly with a rhythm all its own. The more he lingered, the more the marks multiplied, thin pale arcs spreading across shoulders, collarbones, and the sides of his neck, coiling into delicate networks that seemed to measure the weight of each thought, each memory, each tremor of doubt in his mind. His own flesh became a page for the mill's meticulous record, the skin a surface upon which the sins of the past were inked in invisible, crawling lines, each movement leaving its mark, each breath deepening the impressions as though the grain itself exhaled judgment into the body. The wind, still whistling through the shattered sails above, carried with it a chorus of whispers, overlapping, tugging at consciousness like threads pulled taut, insinuating thoughts and half-formed images, compelling recognition of acts never committed yet felt in bone-deep certainty. He could feel the flour shift beneath his fingers as though alive, resisting and yielding at the same time, a pulsing, sentient substance that mirrored his hesitation, anticipating movement before it occurred, pressing into skin and seeping into pores, leaving a residue that no washing could remove, a tactile memory that intertwined with nerve endings and marrow alike. The shadows along the walls lengthened unnaturally, stretching toward him, bending around corners, curling up the warped beams, forming shapes too familiar and too alien, faces of men who had once labored here, their mouths open in silent cries, eyes hollow yet piercing, measuring his worth, his courage, his fear. Every footstep reverberated through the mill, a subtle tremor that ran along floorboards and joists, threading through the bones in his feet, up his legs, into the spine, pressing involuntary acknowledgment from muscle and tendon, forcing posture, stance, and motion into a rhythm dictated by the mill itself. He paused beside one of the massive grinding stones, blackened with years of use and neglect, the surface pitted and scored with countless repetitions of labor, and felt the air thicken further, pressing against his chest, a tangible weight that drew moisture from lungs and skin alike. The sacks of flour shifted closer, whispering louder, the words becoming clearer, forming phrases that were accusation and confession simultaneously, recounting hours of neglect, moments of cruelty, glances of envy, acts of cowardice, all threaded together in a living tapestry that he could not look away from. He could see faint, iridescent lines across his palms where the flour had brushed, small arcs that pulsed, moving in tandem with his pulse, each line a sentence, each network a chapter in a story he had no right to read, yet could not escape. His fingers twitched against the grain, and the sensation ran up forearms and shoulders, curling into subtle contractions, small spasms of muscle that wrote themselves across the flesh, forming patterns that glimmered faintly in the diffused, gray light that filtered through the broken windows. The more he resisted, the more insistent the flower became, a delicate, persistent pressure that wrapped around tendons and veins, coiling across the surface of the body with a precision that was impossible to ignore. His reflection in the shattered glass panes showed pale skin, twitching in small, unnatural rhythms, fine arcs and spirals shimmering faintly under the surface, tracing a language of guilt, regret, and inevitability that no eye could truly decipher. The mill itself seemed to breathe around him, inhaling and exhaling through broken walls and warped beams, the wind outside a mere extension of its awareness, carrying whispers into every corner, threading through floorboards, pressing upon bones and muscles, guiding movements, dictating pauses, demanding acknowledgment, leaving no space untouched by its memory. Hours passed without distinction, the sun inching slowly across the gray sky outside, its pale light catching dust motes that swirled like tiny specters in the wind, and he realized with a sudden, chilling clarity that the mill was not simply haunted by memory or grief. It had become memory incarnate, alive in the flour and dust, in the shifting shadows, in the subtle vibration along every surface, a sentient repository of human error and suffering, patient and deliberate, waiting for him to acknowledge not only his presence, but his complicity, however imagined or inadvertent. The thin, pale lines across his arms and neck writhed, as though aware of his realization, tightening into arcs of certainty, embedding themselves deeper beneath skin, mapping hesitation, fear, and dread into an intricate ledger that was as much part of him now as his own heartbeat. By the time he stumbled toward the center of the room, knees weak, lungs burning, every muscle quivering with the effort of sustaining consciousness, he understood fully that he had crossed a threshold. The mill did not merely observe. It corrected, recorded, and claimed, inscribing not what was, but what could be, drawing from the deepest reserves of fear and regret, weaving the living and the dead into a single, unbroken manuscript of accusation and inevitability. And as the flower quivered beneath his hands, whispering in a chorus of half-formed words and silent cries, he felt the last vestiges of choice slip from his grasp, leaving only the sensation of skin as paper, body as ink, and the mill as an unyielding, eternal witness. By the third day, the whispers had grown into a chorus, layering themselves over one another in a way that made distinction impossible, forming words that had never been spoken aloud, confessions of mistakes, betrayals, and secret transgressions too terrible for the living, carried in voices that were both distant and intimately near, threading through the air like tendrils of smoke that clung to the skin. The flower, pale and tremulous, crawled across his arms and neck in thin, twitching streaks that pulsed faintly, a delicate heat that burned without breaking the skin, leaving impressions that the mind struggled to comprehend, as though the very memory of guilt had been transferred into his flesh and refused to dissipate. The lines coiled and uncoiled with subtle intelligence, following the contours of veins and muscles, wrapping around tendons in patterns that mirrored the sin they represented, arcs and spirals that expanded and contracted with his heartbeat, each pulse a syllable, each shiver a sentence in a language older than speech. He could feel them deep in the marrow, creeping along the bones beneath, tracing paths of fear and hesitation, recording acts he had imagined and acts he would never perform, blurring the line between past, present, and possibility until thought itself became a trembling, involuntary motion of recognition. The mill seemed to bend and twist in the corners of vision, the warped beams stretching upward and downward, contracting and collapsing as though alive, reshaping the space around him to draw him further into its center, where the scent of rot and old wheat was thickest, sticky, and sweet in the nose, choking with every inhalation. The shadows along the walls no longer simply mirrored his movements but acted independently, slithering along beams, coiling around pillars, reaching toward him in delicate, deliberate gestures that mimicked the past lives of laborers crushed beneath centuries of labor, their faces flickering in the gray light through cracked windows, hollow-eyed and accusing, mouths frozen in silent screams. Every step across the creaking floorboards sent vibrations through the wood, subtle tremors that threaded into the flesh of his legs, the tendons of his feet, the spine along its entire length, guiding him, pressing him into positions of acknowledgment, forcing postures that were at once reverent and agonized, a choreography that belonged to the mill and no other. When he brushed against the flour once more, the sensation sharpened, arcs of white crawling across wrists and forearms, spreading in thin, serpentine lines up to the shoulders and neck, coiling in on themselves with a slow, deliberate pulse that marked hesitation, doubt, and even the unspoken recognition of sins he had never known to exist. Each streak glimmered faintly in the weak light, twitching with a life of its own, inscribing guilt onto skin with exquisite precision, the pain subtle but undeniable, a constant reminder that the mill's memory did not merely observe but actively claimed the body as a canvas, the flesh as testimony, the sinew as evidence of a past that was not entirely his own. He felt the flour climb into his hair, brushing against the scalp, leaving faint, twitching impressions along the nape of the neck, small, serpentine scars that formed and reformed without pause, threading through thought and nerve alike, intertwining imagination and memory until distinction was impossible. The air vibrated softly with the sound of whispered names and incomplete sentences, each syllable threading into the tremors of his muscles, curling into arcs of sensation that demanded recognition, bending fingers, elbows, knees in subtle insistence, making stillness itself impossible. The mill's machinery, though long still, seemed to awaken in resonance with his presence, creaking and groaning as if each beam remembered the weight of labor that had pressed against it for decades, centuries even, the pulleys and grinding stones vibrating imperceptibly, threading invisible currents of sensation through the air, through his feet, through the very marrow of his bones. He could sense the history of the mill in the minute vibrations beneath him, the collapse of a scaffolding, the snap of a rope, the hiss of steam or water long vanished, all blending into a tangible memory that pressed against skin and nerve, insisting that acknowledgment be given not only with mind, but with muscle, tendon, and pulse. Every inhale drew in the scent of rot and old flour, thick and clinging, embedding itself in throat, lungs, and sinuses, coating the tongue and teeth with a taste of decay and inevitability. He felt it settle into his chest, a slow pressure against the heart, synchronizing with the thrum of the arcs etched across his skin, the pulsations of flesh mapping guilt with a precision that was impossible to resist, impossible to disbelieve, a ledger written directly into nerve and marrow. As he moved deeper into the mill, the whispers began to form faintly coherent phrases, recounting hours of neglect, moments of cruelty, the stolen flour and missed deadlines, the envy of fellow laborers, the half-forgotten disputes, sins that were both mundane and monstrous, intertwining them with imagined acts of his own life, so that he could not tell where the mill's memory ended and his own conscience began. The lines across his arms and shoulders writhed as the words touched his awareness, each syllable producing a subtle contraction of muscle, a twitching of tendon, a curl of fingers, as though the body itself were compelled to acknowledge, to memorize, to submit to the record inscribed in pale, living arcs. The wind outside gusted, rattling the sails and splintered wood above, carrying the whispers into every corner, threading them through beams and joists, amplifying their insistence, embedding the sound into every pore, vibrating through bone and sinew until thought alone could not separate memory from sensation. Time blurred, hours folded into hours, days into the unmeasured cadence of recognition and submission. He could feel the mill bending the very air, the walls bowing subtly, the floorboards flexing beneath his weight, pressing him into positions that aligned perfectly with the arc of each twitching streak across skin. The flour itself became a river, rising and falling with the rhythm of his pulse, seeping into every hair, pressing lightly into the pores, leaving a residue of sensation that marked his body with the precision of a scribe who knew all his secrets, whether real, imagined, or yet to be committed. Shadows pooled in corners, separated, multiplied, climbing the beams and columns in fluid, impossible patterns, forming tableaus of labor, fear, and sudden death, a theater of accusation that followed him through every movement, isolating, pressing, amplifying every twitch, every contraction, every involuntary acknowledgment of guilt. By the time he reached the center of the mill, knees weak, chest heaving, the flower clinging to every inch of exposed flesh, whispering names in endless repetition, the line between past and present had dissolved entirely. Every twitch of muscle, every shiver along the spine, every faint arc across skin became a sentence in the unbroken manuscript of memory that the mill demanded. He understood, with a chilling clarity, that the whispers were not echoes. They were instructions, the flower not dust but sentient record, the shadows not absence but tribunal, and he was no longer a man entering a mill but a participant in a living, breathing ledger of guilt, fear, and unrelenting, eternal acknowledgment. The mill had claimed him fully, and every movement, every breath, every pulse of muscle and tendon conspired with the whispers and the flower to inscribe him completely into the memory of its long, dark history. He realized the flower did not merely repeat the past, it anticipated it, moving with a precision that seemed almost conscious, responding to thought and hesitation with an intelligence that belonged neither to wood nor wind. Each pause in his step, each flicker of doubt, each tremor in the hands caused new lines to appear, thin and twitching, curling around tendons and wrists, spiraling across forearms and shoulders with a deliberate intent that suggested the presence of an unseen tribunal, one older than law, older than conscience, older than memory itself. The arcs traced themselves with a slow, serpentine grace, threading across veins and muscles in patterns that pressed awareness into every nerve ending, leaving no space unclaimed, every motion a sentence in a ledger that had been waiting centuries to be written. The sensation was subtle yet insistent, a gentle burning and tingling that crept along the skin, pulsing in time with his heartbeat, amplifying thought into muscle, turning hesitation into an involuntary choreography dictated by the grain itself. The air vibrated with quiet insistence, thick and almost viscous, pressing into lungs and spine alike, curling around ribs, bending the shoulders, coiling into the small of the back, as if the mill itself exhaled pressure in rhythm with its memory, guiding him, shaping him, orchestrating movements he did not intend but could not resist. The shadows along the walls writhed independently, climbing up the warped beams, curling into the corners, stretching unnaturally to mirror every twitch, every pause, every thought of evasion, amplifying it into a living accusation that pressed against the senses. The pale flower shifted beneath his hands as he moved, pooling and rippling in patterns that reflected the lines appearing on skin, whispering words that had not been spoken, revealing deeds not yet committed, urging confession for acts not yet imagined. Each inhale carried the smell of rot, old wheat, and iron tang of forgotten labor, filling the nostrils with the memory of decay, embedding itself deep into pores, into throat, into the marrow, pressing the realization that the mill had anticipated him, had known him before he knew himself. He tried to pull away, to step backward, but the floorboards bent subtly beneath each footfall, flexing in ways that guided his steps along paths chosen by centuries of labor, accident, and death, pressing him into the center of the room where the flower was thickest and the whispers loudest. Each movement triggered arcs of pale residue along arms and torso, coiling and spiraling over collarbones and neck, wrapping around shoulders and elbows in delicate loops that tugged involuntarily, bending muscle and tendon to the rhythm of the mill's memory. The whispers became clearer, forming names, accusations, confessions, all layered over one another in a dense web of sound that seemed to rise from the flower itself, penetrating the ears, vibrating along the bones, threading into the spinal cord to force acknowledgment, shaping thought into movement, hesitation into submission. He could feel faint pulsations under the skin, the arcs twitching in time with subtle changes in air pressure, each coil alive, almost sentient, reading intention and marking it instantly, a silent tribunal recording each thought as though it were action. The shadows grew bolder, stretching into twisted, impossible geometries, detaching from walls and beams, curling into quasi-human forms that mirrored gestures before they happened, pressing into awareness like a presence felt but unseen, bending light and perception in ways that made balance precarious, vision unreliable, sound deceptive. Each flicker of the candlelight caught on these shapes, reflecting the twitching arcs across flesh, turning the room into a cathedral of accusation, a living manuscript of labor, error, and inevitability, where past and present coexisted, and every motion, every pulse, every breath became a line in the unbroken ledger of the mill's consciousness. The flower's whispering words were no longer simply repeating what had been. They were predicting, guiding, shaping what would be, coaxing him into postures that anticipated hesitation, marking not only what had happened, but what might happen, folding possibility into flesh, bending the body into confession for crimes he had not committed, yet could feel deeply as if they were already real. Hours passed without clear distinction. The light outside shifted from pale gray morning into the muted, washed-out gold of afternoon, falling across splintered beams and warped floorboards, catching the thin arcs on his arms and shoulders that pulsed faintly, with a rhythm older than breath, older than thought, older than fear. His muscles convulsed subtly with every syllable, every whispered name, each pulse of the flower through fingers and palms, a delicate dance of compliance that left no space untouched, no motion unrecorded, no thought unmarked. The air itself seemed to bend around him, pressing into lungs, expanding and contracting with subtle insistence, weaving the pulse of the mill into tendon, vein, and marrow, drawing the rhythm of labor, suffering, and death into every sinew, until the distinction between body and mill, between memory and flesh, blurred entirely. When he bent closer to examine the flower, he felt it shift like liquid under fingertips, tiny grains rising and falling in miniature waves that clung to skin, crawling up forearms in serpentine threads, entwining with the pale arcs already etched into flesh, creating new patterns as if the mill itself were drawing with invisible hands upon his body, each line a sentence in a language older than time, older than law, older than thought. The whispers thickened, forming sentences that conveyed accusation, judgment, instruction, guiding every twitch, every contraction, every involuntary movement with patient, unyielding insistence. The pulsing sensation climbed along the spine, threading through vertebrae, coiling into shoulders, forcing posture, tilting head, curling fingers into gestures dictated by centuries of memory, a choreography that could not be resisted, only acknowledged. By the time the wind shifted in the broken sails above, carrying a faint, damp scent of rot and wheat, he understood fully that he was no longer merely present in the mill. He had become part of it, a living conduit for its memory. Every tremor of muscle, every contraction of tendon, every twitch across skin a sentence in the unbroken manuscript of guilt and labor, a record not only of what had been, but what the mill foresaw in him, anticipating thought, anticipating hesitation, marking the body in a language that was impossible to deny. He could feel the flower clinging to hair and skin, whispering, pulsing, inscribing, and guiding, a living, patient intelligence that had claimed him entirely, embedding every motion, every thought, every potential sin into the eternal, twisting ledger that waited for no one, forgave no one, and anticipated all who would ever enter its domain. By the seventh night, the mill had become something far beyond structure and wood, a living organism that pulsed with the rhythm of memory, each beam and floorboard bending and twisting in time with the tremor of his heartbeat. Shadows slithered along the warped planks, stretching into impossible angles, curling around pillars, weaving between broken machinery, climbing the walls in semi-autonomous arcs that mirrored his every motion and amplified hesitation into tangible pressure, pressing ribs, bending shoulders, forcing the spine into subtle, unresisting compliance. The flower surged as he moved, pale grains rising in miniature waves like liquid light, coiling around fingers and wrists, slipping into hair and down the collar of his shirt, embedding themselves under skin with a gentle, insistent pulse, leaving impressions that wriggled faintly, alive with an intelligence older than thought. Each step across the floorboards produced vibrations that threaded into tendon and marrow, resonating with the invisible script etched into his body, guiding him without command, bending his movements toward acknowledgment of acts he had never committed and sins that existed only in possibility, and yet somehow they felt inevitable, real, and permanent. The air was thick with the tang of rot and fermented wheat, a heavy sweetness that coated the lungs and teeth, pressing into the diaphragm, embedding itself into the sinew of his chest, turning breath into sensation, sensation into awareness, awareness into terror. He could feel the whispers of the mill rising from the flour, spiraling into the thickened air in delicate waves, repeating names, recounting grievances, revealing half-forgotten betrayals, each syllable coiling into arcs that traced the pale lines already alive upon his skin. The flour seemed to anticipate even the slightest hesitation, rising to meet fingertips before they could brush it, coiling up forearms, over elbows, along shoulders, climbing the neck in twisting patterns that left a faint heat pulsing with every heartbeat, each curve a record of imagined guilt, every spiral a confession he had not yet voiced. When he bent toward the broken windows, his reflection did not resemble a man but a map of trembling lines and coiling arcs, pale against the weak light of the moon, alive with pulse and subtle movement. Every twitch of muscle, every subtle contraction, every involuntary curl of fingers was mirrored in the flour and shadow, each element amplifying the other, weaving together flesh, air, and memory into a single, living manuscript of guilt. The reflection's eyes glimmered with a faint, unnatural awareness, as if the map itself could see, judging, recording, anticipating the next tremor of thought before the mind could even form it. He could feel the shapes of sins yet uncommitted pressing through tendon and marrow, bending the body into acknowledgment, guiding knees to bend, shoulders to lift, fingers to curl in a precise, unspoken choreography dictated by centuries of labor, accident, and death embedded into the mill's walls and floors. The wind outside gusted, rattling the splintered sails, carrying the stench of old wheat and damp rot through the cracks in the boards, but it was not the wind that moved him. Each gust synchronized with the pulse of the flour, threading through air and skin alike, a gentle insistence that moved muscles into postures of confession, pressed the spine into arcs that echoed the tremors traced across his arms, over his shoulders, down his back, across the collarbones, weaving tendon and sinew into a ledger that had existed long before he arrived. The shadows climbed higher now, peeling away from walls and columns, twisting into quasi-human shapes that followed him like predators, pressing attention into his peripheral vision, bending the space around him into a theater of accusation, where every twitch, every contraction, every subtle flex of finger or tendon became amplified, scrutinized, and recorded. The flour coiled across his torso, leaving faint arcs that glimmered in pale light, twisting and looping with subtle, deliberate rhythm, pulling involuntary contractions from the chest and shoulders, coiling down the arms, over wrists, across knuckles, pressing the body into a sequence that read like language, like confession, like judgment, like history itself. Each grain seemed to pulse against nerve endings, a small, imperceptible pressure that threaded into marrow and tendon alike, drawing a record that merged the memory of laborers long dead with his own body, mapping fear, regret, and hesitation into every arc, every coil, every line. The whispers grew into a low hum, a chorus of syllables that pressed into bone, vibrating through vertebrae, threading into feet and hands, forcing posture, twisting muscle into acknowledgment, bending flesh into the record the mill demanded, until the body itself seemed to belong entirely to it. As the night deepened, the mill expanded in perception and intensity. The boards bowed beneath his weight, the beams stretched imperceptibly, guiding him into the center of the room where the flour was thickest, richest, and most insistent. The grains rose like a tide, blanketing him in suffocating clouds, each inhalation pressing the scent of rot and old wheat deeper into throat and lungs, coating tongue and teeth with the flavor of decay, embedding memory into marrow. Lines of pale flour climbed from forearms to elbows, over shoulders, across chest and back, intertwining into complex, undulating patterns that writhed faintly, alive with pulse, shaping body and thought alike. Every twitch of fingers, every involuntary flex of tendon, every quiver of muscle became a sentence, each pulse of the heart a syllable in the unbroken ledger that the mill had been composing long before he arrived, and would continue long after he was gone. When he tried to avert eyes from the broken windows, shadows in peripheral vision multiplied and stretched, coiling across floor and wall in impossible geometries, pressing against ribs, curling over shoulders, tugging involuntarily at elbows and wrists, a choreography of accusation and acknowledgment, echoing the arcs of flour already alive on his skin. He realized fully, with a chilling clarity, that resistance was impossible. The mill did not merely witness, it anticipated, guided, and inscribed. Every tremor, every contraction, every involuntary movement was claimed, recorded, and amplified in the whispering flour, in the bending shadows, in the living memory of splintered beams and warped floorboards. By the end of the seventh night, he was no longer a man entering a mill but a living ledger, every fiber of tendon, every line of muscle, every nerve ending pulsing with the mill's memory, the flour wrapping, marking, inscribing him entirely, leaving only the faint, undeniable tremor of acknowledgment in each motion, a witness to guilt beyond thought, beyond time, beyond mercy. When he finally stumbled from the mill at dawn, the world was washed in pale, gray light that made the broken sails glisten with dew, each droplet reflecting 1,000 shadows that had never belonged to the day. The village below expected to find a corpse, mangled and hollowed by weeks of exposure to rot and whispering flour, but the body that emerged was unmistakably his, trembling violently, skin taut and quivering as if every nerve and tendon had become a conduit for the mill's ceaseless judgment. Pale lines crawled across forearms, shoulders, and collarbones in delicate, twisting arcs that pulsed faintly, with a rhythm older than thought, faint and alive, mapping both remembered sins and imagined trespasses with a precision that made the living tremble in recognition of a truth they could neither name nor deny. He fell to the dew-soaked ground, hands clawing at the earth, trying to separate himself from the weight that pressed along every tendon and sinew. But it was useless. The memory of the mill had sunk into him deeper than marrow, folding into each heartbeat, each breath, each trembling pulse of muscle, claiming him as both witness and participant in a ledger that had no beginning and would have no end. Yet the horror did not end with his trembling emergence, for the whispers that had once slithered among the beams and sacks of flour followed him, carried on the morning wind, reaching every corner of the village with a subtle, insistent presence. Each breath of air seemed to hum with names never spoken aloud, secrets never uttered, small betrayals and imagined sins that had no anchor in reality, yet felt impossibly, unbearably real. Windows rattled faintly as though the panes themselves recognized the weight of revelation. Doors quivered on hinges, and the faint, metallic tang of fermented wheat and rot seeped into the streets, lingering in alleys, pressing into the lungs of every villager with a silent insistence. Some raised trembling hands to arms and necks, feeling the same twitching arcs that had traced the first man's flesh, pale lines that were invisible yet undeniable, coiling over veins, threading through tendons, leaving a pulse of certainty in bone and marrow, a certainty that they were being read, recorded, judged by an intelligence older than law, older than memory, older than the concept of sin itself. The whispers multiplied as the villagers moved through their homes, carried into rooms that had never known the mill, pressing against walls, curling along beams, tracing the corners of their perception, insinuating themselves into the marrow of thought. They felt the faint brush of flour along wrists and collars, a ghostly touch that left trembling trails beneath skin, impressions that pulsed with the same deliberate rhythm, each line a reflection of imagined trespasses, unspoken betrayals, secrets that had never existed until now, and yet existed absolutely, irreversibly. Mothers clutched trembling children. Men pressed palms to faces. Young girls ran hands along arms, feeling the coiling, delicate lines that writhed faintly beneath skin, and the certainty grew that there was no denial, no resistance, no hiding, that the ledger of the mill had expanded beyond wood and stone, beyond sails and broken floors, into the very flesh of all who lived nearby. The man who had emerged from the mill trembled still, feeling the pulse of judgment coursing through him, each arc and coil a sentence of accusation and memory, yet aware that the mill's reach now extended beyond his body. When he looked back up the hill, the sails stood unmoving, yet he could feel the presence there, patient, eternal, a sentinel of a justice older than memory itself, waiting silently, insidiously, to consume any hand that dared touch the pale, whispering flower again. Shadows along the broken beams seemed to reach into the village, elongating over rooftops, climbing chimneys, curling around doorframes, suggesting shapes that no eye could follow but that every nerve felt with insistent clarity, a choreography of accusation that pressed into bone, muscle, and tendon, bending posture, twitching fingers, curving spines into postures of acknowledgment. By midday, the village was a landscape of subtle terror, the sun casting muted light over fields and canals, while the whispers coursed invisibly through streets, pressing into lungs, threading along veins, forcing acknowledgment of sins that had never been named, acts that had never been committed, thoughts that had never been thought. The first man's trembling hands left faint impressions in dew-soaked dirt, arcs and coils of pale flour imprinting themselves on the earth, a miniature echo of the ledger inscribed upon flesh, and every villager who stepped near the traces felt the same pulse, a resonance threading along muscle and bone, guiding movement, bending posture, curling fingers in silent acknowledgment of transgression both real and imagined. Doors opened with a subtle vibration, shutters rattled faintly as if whispering names. The wind carried the faint metallic tang of rot and old wheat into the fields, pressing against hair, skin, and tendon with a persistent insistence, embedding memory and judgment into every inhalation. By evening, no villager could sleep without feeling the pulse of the mill's memory threading into tendon and sinew, twisting muscle into subtle confessions that existed only in thought, yet pressed upon the flesh as tangibly as a hand. The man who had emerged from the mill wandered the streets, pale lines still twitching across arms and shoulders, each step leaving a residue of tremors in air and earth, each breath carrying the whispers that bent thought, bending posture, shaping reality into acknowledgment. Children cried with the faint twitching of arcs across their wrists. Mothers trembled with subtle lines curling along forearms. Men pressed fingers to collarbones, feeling arcs coil imperceptibly, unknowably, yet undeniably, a language of memory and guilt older than law, older than conscience, older than human comprehension. And in the quietest hours of night, when the wind was still, the mill on the hill appeared silent, sails unmoving, shadows settled, yet the pulse of judgment continued beneath beams, beneath floorboards, beneath every grain of flour, waiting patiently, watching, remembering. Its presence had expanded beyond the wood, beyond the stone, beyond the man who had entered, beyond the village itself. Any hand daring to touch its whispering flower would find itself immediately claimed, inscribed, folded into the unending ledger, a living manuscript of guilt, fear, and inevitability that stretched infinitely, patiently, mercilessly, into all who dared inhale its scent, feel its touch, or imagine its power. The village, once unaware of the mill's sentience, now breathed with it, lived within it, and the pale, twitching lines beneath skin were a constant reminder that judgment older than thought, older than memory, older than life itself, had no end and no reprieve.